Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Magnolia United Church of Christ Learning Forum for the month of April. This is brought to you by Humanities of Washington. My name is Marcy Scott Weiss. I'm the senior pastor here at Magnolia UCC, and I'll be moderating tonight's event. We want to begin by acknowledging that we present this program from the traditional lands of the Duwamish peoples who have stewarded this land for generations. The presentation that you're about to enjoy is part of Humanities Washington Speaker Bureau program. And Humanities Washington is a nonprofit program dedicated to sparking conversation and critical thinking. And it provides many other cultural programs to hundreds of thousands of people throughout Washington each year. And I'd encourage you to visit their website, and I will put that link in the chat comments to find other events just like this one. A quick note on civil discourse. The Speakers Bureau program is designed to generate open and honest conversations on a whole lot of topics, some of which can sometimes be controversial. We encourage differing perspectives and viewpoints, but also ask that you treat this topic, the speaker, and each other with respect. And also please note that this event is being recorded. So a bit about our speaker this evening. Tonight, we are honored to welcome Dr. Jacob Lewis from the School of Politics, Philosophy, and Public Affairs at Washington State University. His research focuses on the relationship between trust, conflict, and democracy. And his work has been published in the Journal of Peace Research, Political Behavior, Political Psychology, Political Geography, Social Movement Studies, the Journal of Conflict Resolution, and more. Tonight, Dr. Lewis is going to be speaking for about 45 minutes on the topic of why trust is essential to democracy, as we consider the question of how we can work to rebuild trust together and create a stronger democratic future. We're going to ask you to hold your questions to the end of about a 45-minute presentation. But if questions come up during that time that you want answered during the Q&A session, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll get to that during the Q&A session. Also, during the Q&A time, I'm going to post an evaluation in the comment section, and we would really appreciate it if you would all fill that out. So thank you again to Humanities of Washington and to Dr. Lewis, who I will turn it over to now. Thank you, Dr. Lewis, for being here.
Thank you, everybody. And before I start, can you all hear me properly? Great. Okay. Well, I hope you can hear me and not the screaming baby that's directly above me, but there is a 1-year-old just screaming his lungs out. So I'm going to try to remain focused. Thank you so much for having me here. As you mentioned, I am an associate professor at Washington State University, and I'm really excited to share this talk with you that focuses on why trust is essential for democracy. Now, I'm going to beg your patience a little bit because I know oftentimes in the American context, we talk about trust and democracy from the perspective as Americans. But I myself am a scholar of African politics. And before I was an academic, I worked with USAID, primarily working across Africa. So my journey to the question of trust and democracy, it really emerges out of this sort of path that I've taken of designing and implementing trust-building interventions in conflict-affected states throughout the world. And so what I'm going to try to do tonight is give you an overview of the conceptual approaches to trust and how scholars of trust think about it. And we'll talk a little bit about what it looks like in our own context. And then I'll bring in my own research, which I hope provides an outside or exterior view to provide different context for this. Thank you again. By the way, I have participants on my left, and then the PowerPoint's on my right, and my notes are in the middle. So if I'm looking all over the place, it's just because of I'm trying to make sure I get everybody. So okay. I want to start by putting us in a rhetorical moment, and that's the democratic moment that we're in. And so I would ask you to, for 1 minute, think of somebody that you know that you disagree with strongly on a political level. Somebody whose vote doesn't make sense to you, or they might want different policies that you don't understand, or even, more fundamentally, their values feel alien to you. Many of us have people like this in our lives, people whose politics seem way too far right, way too far left, way too whatever for us. We don't understand. And I would ask you, do you trust that person? And then I would ask you to ask yourself, what do I even mean by trust? Trust is this nebulous, difficult concept, right? And throughout this talk, I'm going to ask you to question your own ideas of trust. Okay, so let's spend a little bit of time looking at trust and democracy in action. Here in America, sitting president has refused to commit to accepting election results. And about half the country believes that one of our recent elections in 2020 was stolen. Political violence from January 6th to attempted assassinations of the president have moved from being unthinkable to being not only thinkable, but somewhat common. And as we'll discuss in a few slides, trust in the government itself is at rock bottom levels. Okay. Now, if we move to Europe, the far right has come within striking distance of parliamentary majorities in France. The Alternative for Deutschland is now Germany's second largest political party. And until recently in Hungary, Viktor Orban focused on systematically dismantling the institutional architecture of liberal democracy through gradual erosion of norms that to the point where citizens stopped defending them because they stopped believing in them. And you don't have to take my word for it. The term a liberal democracy emerged from Viktor Orban himself. And in the area that I work, in South Africa, 30 years after the miracle of 1994, at the end of apartheid and the transition to a multi-party state, we've seen a cratering of trust in democratic institutions. For example, recently in 2024, we saw the lowest voter turnout that we've seen in the past 30 years. And pardon me, and the African National Congress, which was once the ascendant party with nearly 70% of the vote, now scrapes by with about 40% of the vote. All of this occurs as unemployment has gone up and trust in the government and one another has gone down. What do we see here in these? Each of these has a concept, or sort of within each concept is the idea of trust in our institutions, but also trust in each other. So the thread of all of these is something like this, and it's maybe being a little too cute to say it, right? But that as trust erodes, democracy doesn't end with a bang, right? It's not like one day you have democracy and then the next day you don't have democracy, but rather you see a sort of hollowing out of democracy. It looks like it's standing, but on the inside, it's gone hollow or gone rotten. Okay, so the quantitative data further emphasize this decline. Let's take a look at just a few data points here. A 2023 Pew Research poll found that across 24 advanced economies, only 54% of adults trusted their national governments. In the United States, trust in the federal government has essentially hit rock bottom, right? The number of people that believe that the government will do just about always or most of the time will do the right thing sits at around 16%, right? Now, this was at 70% in the 1950s. So less than a century ago, we've seen this rapid decline. A 2024 Gallup poll found that American confidence in the Congress, Supreme Court, and the presidency and media have reached record or near record lows. For example, right, one factoid is Congress sits at about 8% right now. And I'm sorry, I'm just getting over a cold. Again, I have two kids in daycare, so it's a petri dish. Um, the 2024 Edelman Trust Barometer found that for the first time across the globe, more than half of respondents described their governments and media as divisive forces rather than as unifying ones. Okay, again, here, note that what I'm getting you to is an understanding that we see a rapid decline in people saying that they trust their governments. And this is happening in democratic governments, right? Presumably the ones that are most responsive to citizens. Okay, so let's look a little bit more deeply into what might be driving these findings. Well, polarization is certainly something that we've heard a lot of over the past 10 years. And we can talk for a moment about affective polarization. Essentially, the idea that if the other side likes it, I don't like it, right? The affective polarization literature documents that Americans now dislike the opposing party more than they like their own party, right? Consider what that means. And that this is a shift not about policy, but about identity, about group tribal loyalty. I'm sure many of you have heard about this. Ezra Klein talks about it, for example. This has sort of been a pretty big topic across the past decade. And Pew in 2022 found that 72% of Republicans and 63% of Democrats describe the other party as more immoral than most Americans. Majorities on both sides are now describing the other as a threat to the nation's well-being. Now, this is going to come up in a little bit when we talk about the load-bearing pillars of democracy. We've also seen political violence and tolerance thereof rising. The varieties of democracy data demonstrate that political violence and intimidation of civil society actors increased in over 40 countries between 2019 and 2023. Right? In the United States, the FBI has documented a sustained rise in domestic terrorism incidents and threats against election workers, public health officials, and school board members since 2020. Now, to move to the area where I work, in South Africa, the assassination of local politicians, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal, has risen to be not quite a common occurrence, but certainly a recurring one. Finally, we're simply losing faith in democracy. Again, think about what I'm talking about with that losing trust in our institutions. Okay? Recent work in the Journal of Democracy demonstrated that the share of Americans who say that it's essential to live in democracy rapidly declined. Those who were born in the 1930s, 72% of them said it was necessary to live in a democracy. Those, like myself, born in the 1980s, only about 30% said that it was necessary to live in a democracy. The varieties of democracy data also demonstrate that levels of democracy enjoyed by the average global citizen is back to levels from 1986, while 42% of the global population is experiencing active autocratization. Okay, and then okay, just moving down here. So we need to figure out what the stakes are here. And what I'm going to try to detail for you is what scholars have found to be a linkage between trust in institutions and trust in one another. And the first way we do that is looking at norms. Now, the standard response to the democratic crisis has focused on institutions. And I know that many of you probably have a lot of experience with this. I've heard there's even a law scholar in the audience here. And so I'm sure that there will be some good questions here. But institutions are not just sort of buildings and the people that work in them. We have to understand what an institution is functionally. And the way that political scientists think about them is as a collection of rules. And these rules really only function when people agree to follow them, to enforce them, and to hold others within the institution accountable to those norms. Right? That agreement is critical. Right? The informal understandings of how power should or should not be understood. And of course, this sort of informality is difficult to measure. It's difficult to observe, right? And it's often the first to be under attack. Now, in 2018, Levitsky and Ziblatt published a very seminal book called How Democracies Die. If you haven't read this, I highly suggest it. And they articulate two core load-bearing pillars for democracy. Right? The first is this idea of mutual toleration, that competition is important and your opponent is not necessarily an enemy, right? That they can be legitimate even if they seek something alternative to what you pursue, right? So accepting the legitimacy of your political opponents is critical. The second is the idea of institutional forbearance, the idea that when I'm in power, I don't use all the levers of power to reshape the institutions to the sort of silhouette of my political party. This is what you see in South Africa. This is what we saw in Hungary. This is certainly what we see in Russia. The idea that I'm going to switch all the rules and change them so that way I'm always playing on a sort of uneven playing field and I have the upper hand. Both of these require trust. Okay? Mutual toleration requires you to trust that the other side does indeed have a legitimate set of policy governing points. And institutional forbearance requires you to trust that when the other side is in power, they will practice that same restraint. And at the bottom here, we have this sort of critical quote it's sort of a seminal quote in comparative political science by Adam Jaworski, in which his minimal definition of democracy is not about voting, it's not about parties or whatever. It just says democracy is a system in which parties lose elections, not necessarily one in which they gain, right? Because you can have an election where a party wins and they never let go of power. That's no longer a democracy, right? The ability to lose an election and say, okay, we'll get them next time, is critical to the way comparative political scientists understand democracy. So the next question is, well, okay, this is great about institutions, but what do we mean by trust, right? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. The first is a way of categorizing trust, and this is a categorization of social trust. If anybody's read Robert Putnam's sort of seminal 2000 book called Bowling Alone, right? He articulated what he started in his 1993 book, which is called Making Democracy Work. He articulates this idea of bonding or bridging trust, right? Bonding trust is this like solidarity that we generate within dense homogeneous networks. So your family, your church, your synagogue, your mosque, your ethnic group, a place where you don't feel like you're making a connection across type. You're making a connection within type, right? In the American context, you can think of northeastern Italian immigrant communities that came in the turn of the 20th century. You can think of Black churches in the American South. And in the South African example, you can think of the Black anti-apartheid movement that sort of remained strong even despite government repression for 50 years. So there's a lot of benefit that comes from this bonding trust, right? Material support, identity, strengthening of identity, norms of reciprocity. But there's also some downsides. And that's bonding is exclusionary, right? We build tight networks with our own, but it becomes harder for others to sort of build connections with us, right? So you could imagine situations that have pretty strong democratic consequences. For example, ethnic or religious communities, right, that have high internal trust in a nascent democracy, let's say Nigeria or Ghana, we can go to Zimbabwe, but have low external trust, might prefer patronage politics when their guy gets in power over some meaningful, broad, universal, distributive policies, right? And then you get a cycle of patronage. And this is what Peter Ecke calls the two publics, right? So what's the counter to this? Well, the counter is what Putnam calls bridging trust, right? This is trust that extends across social divides, across race, across class, across religion, partisanship, etc. Right? Now, this forms a bridge, but it's thinner by nature than bonding trust, right? But this trust helps to hold democratic societies together, right? Now, so here's some concrete examples from the work that I've done, right? during the period of sort of post-colonial uh, independence, we saw labor unions often serve as the primary bulwarks in African countries against autocratic regimes. Right? Certainly, for example, in South Africa. Right? So if you're part of a labor union, that labor union's not organized around your identity, your religion, anything like that. It's like you're part of it because you work in a mine, right? And here's this ability to make connections across type and stand up to the apartheid government. Now, following the 1994 election, when apartheid was overturned, the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission actively tried to build this type of bridging trust. I think I have a slide about this, right? The idea of bridging trust, right? We are going to come together as a nation and bridge across ethnic divides, bridge across racial divides, etc. And we're going to try in some ways to cultivate that idea of civic identity. The cool thing about that would be if you can do that properly, then bridging turns to bonding. Now, as any sort of keen observer of South African politics will note, right, the African National Congress sort of failed to do this, right? And this brings us to this sort of pathology of bonding without bridging, right? That you can arrive at a situation where even in a dense rainbow nation, right, or highly diverse neighborhoods where we would expect lots of bridging to happen, we see a lot of bonding or hunkering down, but no bridging. Work by McCartan Humphreys has demonstrated this. Putnam himself has demonstrated this, right? Now, this is not an implication that diversity is bad, but rather that you need to actively pursue those bridges, right? Bridges are much harder to build than bonds. Okay. So, how should we think about trust? I asked you earlier to ask yourself, what even does trust mean? Right? We all have a sort of the gestalt of it. I trust this person or that person, but we often struggle to figure out, well, what does it mean to say I trust somebody? Scholars in comparative politics and political psychology have focused on three different conceptualizations. The first we pull back to Robert Putnam. And there's this idea of generalized trust, the idea that trust is a generalized disposition toward neighbors, right? Most people could be trusted, one might say. This can be measured through standard survey items. If I go around with a census and ask people not just about who they are, but whether they trust one another, etc. And this really matters for civic outcomes, right? If I trust others, I'm more likely to vote because I believe that the vote will count. I can engage in voluntary associations, right? That could be everything from the sort of titular bowling leagues that Robert Putnam talks about to joining the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, some small NGO that works on environmental stuff, you name it, right? Book clubs, etc. It also helps us maintain quality of government because people show up to town council meetings. So there's a lot of utility here, both for democracy as well as for analysis. And Putnam's landmark work in Italy, which is called Making Democracy Work, really showed that the regional governments in Italy that performed the best were those that had these long-standing, deep traditions of civic engagement that went back basically centuries. Right. Now, there are also some potential challenges to defining trust this way, right? If I come to you and say, well, do you believe that most people can be trusted? Or even if I say most other Americans can be trusted, one critical challenge is your identity. If you're a white American, you might think, hey, most other Americans are white. I'm white. So there's an in-group thing that you don't even know is happening. If you're a Black American or Mexican American, an Asian American, a Muslim American, you're thinking from a position of being in the minority, saying most Americans are not like me, right? And so this measure might be measuring what you think of most Americans, or it might be measuring what you think of people that are not like you, right? And so this is itself challenging to our understanding of democracy. Okay. The next step is the step toward a moralistic view of trust. And this comes from Rick Oslamer. And his core argument is like, listen, trust is this weird thing because if we link trust to democracy, we mostly don't meet everybody in our democracy. We mostly don't meet everybody in our own neighborhood, right? Or even our own church or synagogue or mosque. How am I supposed to know if I trust other people? Trust can't just be an actual evaluation of if other people are trustworthy. It has to be more like a moral value, not a rational calculation. Okay. So moralistic trusters are those who basically believe the world is fundamentally decent, and you extend trust to these broad moral communities that you have. Now, this is really useful if you want to understand why generalized trust seems to be a stable trait over time. If you ask people over and over and over again, year after year, high trusting people sort of remain high trusting, and low trusting people kind of low trusting, and well, they go up and down a little bit, but you rarely see a flip, right? It's uncommon that a high truster becomes a low truster or vice versa, right? And so what we see here is that this is a sort of moral evaluation that links not just to trust, but evaluations about how should democracies operate, how should economies be distributed, etc. Okay. Why is this the case? Because moralistic communities entail the idea of a shared fate. I share my fate with you, even though you're on the opposite side of the state with me, right? And I share my fate with somebody in Florida, even though they're literally on the opposite corner of this country to me. But the challenge with this, from a sort of policy perspective, is well, if trust is a moral thing, then how do we build policies that address it? Is it possible even to increase or decrease trust? I'm going to argue yes, and I'll talk about my research later. Finally, we have Russell Hardin's work that looks at the idea of encapsulated interests. I'm realizing it might be hard to see with the dark blue. I apologize about that. Russell Hardin argues like, no, trust is really sort of relational and rational and small. I believe, like, I trust you to do something because I believe doing that thing is in your interest. Maybe it's a transaction, right? I've paid you to, I don't know, sell me a car or do some work in my backyard or you name it. It's in your interest to do that to get the money, right? Okay, that's one way to think about it, right? But this idea here is that trust is cognitive and quite specialized and earned. We don't trust people without knowing whether that they encapsulate our interests. Now, this is really useful for analyzing specific trust interests, right? For example, if I want to understand how aid donors relate to their sort of aid implementers, right, or citizens to their government officials, right, or broadly to civil society. This is really helpful. It raises sort of the right questions, right? What would give them the incentive to do the thing they said they were going to do? Why should I vote for them, for example? But this runs into trouble because how do you move this to a large scale, right? In a democracy, we mostly don't meet these people, right? We've already established this. So how should I know whether I trust my fellow citizens? I don't know if their interests or my interests are encapsulated in theirs. So we have these categories. Cool. But how do they relate to one another? And here's where I want to bring in this idea of, I forgot to show you each of the slides. Well, I apologize for that. How does trust relate to itself? I want to talk to you about this directionality question here. And so I want to ask you, imagine you live in a country where courts are corrupt, the police are unreliable, let's say they stop you for reasons that are kind of obviously phony, right? And the government routinely breaks its promises. Now, these are statements about the government. But the question is, in that context, are you likely to trust your neighbors more or less, right? Basically, the question is, how do you fix this? And this is a big challenge that my work is oriented around. So there was a seminal piece by Dennison and Sonderskow in Political Behavior that basically purports to solve this, right? They come in with this puzzle and they say, listen, it might be, on the one hand, that social trust is what generates institutional trust, right? Democratic reform has to be grassroots. We have to start in civil society. We invest in our local community institutions, and over time, we're able to build broader institutions that we trust that will do basically the thing they're supposed to do. Alternatively, we might say, actually, institutional trust and showing that the government operates properly solves a lot of potential coordination challenges among citizens, and therefore you can have a strong social fabric because people are certain that the government is going to take care of what it says is going to take care of. So you have a ground up or a top down puzzle here. And what Dinnerson and Sonderskow find, they run this data across some panel data across Denmark. So you know your results may vary, right? And this is part of what I test myself. Is that actually we have to see high levels of institutional trust in order to maintain social trust. Okay, so if I trust the government will do well, I'm more likely to trust citizens. There's essentially some breathing room there, right? Whereas if I don't trust other citizens, I'm not likely to increase my trust in the state itself, in the institutions, right? All of this means that there's a recursive challenge here that we might call a social trap. If the government starts to fail, then we stop trusting our citizens, our fellow neighbors, right? Which may indeed lead to lower trust in institutions, which reduces trust in citizens, etc. Right? It's a vicious cycle, we might call it. Okay. So this social trap is the idea that trust or distrust breeds distrust. And Bo Rothstein's work on this idea of the social trap really demonstrates this, right? So if this relationship is reciprocal, it runs in both directions. Low institutional trust erodes social trust, which then makes it harder to build legitimate trusts or institutions. I'm sorry. So what do I mean when I say this is the work, this is what my work looks at? Well, again, I come from this humanitarian background where I'm working in places that have had weak governments, corrupt governments, and high levels of conflict. And so those are the places that most need democracy to resolve conflict, and yet they're least capable of doing so. Okay. And now I want to talk about this. My own work, basically, I'm going to look at 4 different areas. Now, all of this takes place in Africa. I hope that it's of interest to you all. I tried to sort of position this talk universally, but now we're going to move into my work here. So let's start with my first study. And this looks at the relationship between violence and trust in institutions, or really satisfaction with democracy. So this piece was published in Political Behavior. And the question is really like, when ordinary citizens of a democratic society live close to violence, and by violence in this case, I'm really looking at violent riots. And I can talk more about what those were about. They were largely about service delivery. Does it change how they feel about democracy, right? So does exposure of something that might reduce perceived legitimacy of the state reduce how satisfied you are with democracy broadly? Okay. Now, again, this is building on that Dinnerson and Sonderskow work, but I'm trying to demonstrate it outside of a Danish context. Okay. So South Africa has often been called a violent democracy. It's a vibrant one, but it's also quite violent. And between 2000 and 2023, the armed conflict location event data showed that there were just over 7,600 violent riots in South Africa alone. Right? Using geocoded data on these riots and taking polling data, but basically public polling data that are also geocoded, I merged them together, and around each respondent, I created a spatial buffer, and I counted the number of violent riots that each individual had been exposed to in the preceding 6 months. Basically, for each respondent, it's like, how violent have your surroundings been, right? And then what I did was I measured, well, okay, based on how violent your surroundings have been, can we tell anything about your satisfaction with democracy. Now, my key finding here is pretty clear and consistent, which is that respondents living close to recent violent riots report significantly lower satisfaction with democracy, not just with the current government, right? Not like, oh, I trust the government less or I don't like them so much, and not just with specific parties. It's not like I'm switching from party to party. Rather, it's the democratic system itself that takes the heat, right? A respondent at the high end of riot exposure is about 40% more likely to say they're not at all satisfied with South African democracy than one with no exposure, right? And now there's some good news, which is that there's a temporal decay. I find that the longer it's been since you've experienced riots, the higher your trust is. So maybe there's a bounce back. Okay. So not a great start. We're not feeling very good right now. Let's dig that hole a little deeper. The second study I co-published with my former doctoral student. She's now an assistant professor at a small liberal arts college. And what we decided to do was say, okay, we know that trust shapes perceptions of democracy, but what about violence shapes satisfaction with democracy, but what about trust itself? So we used similar methods and similar data, right? This sort of public polling data across all of Africa, and we got 14 countries in this. So I say all of Africa so geographically, but I don't mean country-wise. And we also take a look at exposure to everything from riots to violent extremist events, right? Terrorist organizations, explosions, battles, right? All the types of things that we would imagine would shake you, right? Now, the core idea here is something like, if trust operates like in a sort of instrumental way, when there's conflict, we become more scared, we become more resource concerned and more risk averse, and so we'll be more likely to see a decrease in generalized trust, but an increase in in-group trust, right? I cling to my in-group and that sort of hunkering down that Putnam talked about. But what do we actually find? We actually find all trust goes down across the board, right? So we expected generalized trust to decline. We expected out-group trust to decline. We didn't expect in-group trust to decline, but it did, right? So what does this do? This runs totally counter to what scholars had thought would be the case, which is this sort of polarization of trust. And instead, there's a sort of general capacity. So we may actually be finding Uslarner's work to be right, even though we're seeing that it is more responsive than he originally thought. Okay, I see that I have 8 minutes left. I'm going to get there. So the final two studies that I want to talk about are all about directly testing institutions. So I recently finished up a study in Zimbabwe. It was a multi-year study. And this study is all about the idea that elections themselves, right? If you think about an election, it's the paradigmatic democratic institution, right? You can't have a democracy without an election, right? So elections should be these sort of causes for, I don't know, hope, we might think, right? But what happens when the election itself, the spectacle, the occurrence becomes a traumatic trigger? And so I worked in Zimbabwe for a few years, and this offers what I think is a clarifying case, right? Decades of state-sanctioned electoral violence from the sort of early 80s when the ruling party engaged in ethnic cleansing in an area called Matabeleland, called Gukurahundi, to the 2008 elections where the ruling party kind of lost and then fought its way back into power. Basically, the very act of holding an election is a fearful sort of trauma-induced event. And so what I wanted to test is whether mere exposure to an election might increase fear and decrease trust, right? Because that again gets us to this idea that there's a directionality, that if I don't trust an institution, I should be less likely to trust my fellow citizens. So the first thing I wanted to do is just look at, do these elections reduce or increase fear and reduce trust? I used randomized household surveys conducted before and after the 2023 election in 12 communities across 4 districts. And with my team, we measured generalized trust, community trust, in-group ethnic trust, out-group ethnic trust, and also fear. All forms of trust reduced following the election, and almost all forms of fear increased following the election. Right? So this happened even when we held into account levels of violence that occurred in the area and personal experiences of violence of each respondent. Right? So holding those constant, we still see a reduction in trust and increase in fear. Okay? So this means the election itself matters. The institution is producing a reduction in trust. This is a critical failure if you want to build a democracy. But let's try to end hopefully on a good note, right? I didn't bring you all here to bum you out. Can trust be rebuilt? This is the second study that comes out of this broader research work that I did. And this project attempts to move from sort of diagnosis of a problem to an intervention. So in the same 12 communities that I worked in, we also randomly assigned basically different treatments. So we had 12 communities, 3 were controls, they didn't receive any treatment. 3 received something called a community values workshop, where we brought together people to do something like a bonding trust exercise. Let's all work together to talk about the values of our community, right? The next 3 received a psychosocial awareness and coping workshop. We worked with local mental health providers to try to bring perpetrator and victim together to figure out how they can mutually understand their past history where somebody did violence to the other. And then in the final 3 communities, they got both treatment. And what did I find? Well, in the compared to the control, in the communities that received the bonding intervention, we saw modest but real improvements in fear reduction and openness to diversity. In communities receiving both interventions, we saw increased tolerance for ethnic and political outgroup members. The trauma processing workshops were a bit trickier. They actually increased fear, which kind of makes sense. We should have seen that coming. And perceptions of social cohesion dipped before recovering over time. Right. So the takeaway here is that rebuilding trust is not a single step intervention. It's slow, it's context sensitive, and the content of the intervention really matters. But it matters in a way that we can improve over time. Okay, that's just what I said. So I want to conclude within the next minute, right? Trust is not a cultural luxury. It is in self infrastructure. It is foundational to democratic life, as foundational as courts, elections, and constitutions. Recall that everything I've talked about is that as you lose faith in those, you lose faith in each other, right? And just to be on time, democracy is not just a set of rules, it's a set of relationships. We need to understand it as being between citizens that have agreed to share a common fate and to resolve their disagreements through peaceful means rather than violence. But when trust erodes, democracy does not collapse all at once. It becomes weak, it becomes hollow. Participation falls, civic life thins, movements fracture, and norms bend until they break. Trust is slow to build and fast to erode. As anybody with kids knows, we tell them that often. It's both an output of well-functioning democracy and a prior condition for democracy. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me. I have the next 15 minutes to answer your questions, but if we run out of time, I also have my email up here as well. Thank you all so much.
Jacob, thank you so much for doing that. That was a lot to take in. And I want to just kick it off with a couple of questions. in your last comment, that trust is slow to build and fast to erode. And I'm wondering if you can just kind of address. I hear your research and what you did in Africa, and I'm wondering if you can extrapolate those findings to what's happening in our country right now in regards to trust and democracy and the erosion of trust in our democracy. In particular, I guess I have a lot of concern for folks who are in generation Z and Generation Alpha. And I'm curious if you focused any of your research on those younger generations.
Thank you for that question. I'll start the second part is the easier thing to say, which is I haven't looked too much at that in the trust perspective. Now there's a separate part of my research that I didn't talk about today that looks at political anti-Semitism in America and across the world, and so I kind of have some stuff to talk about there, but it's not trust so much. I'm happy to talk about it, but I want to make sure I get to your core question, which is this idea of slow to build, fast. Slow to build, fast to erode. How does that speak to our own system? Not to be too much of a fanboy to Peter Dennison and Kim Manamara Sandroskov, but I am basically a fanboy for them, and their idea of directionality, I think, has been demonstrated more and more to be true. That as we lose faith in our institutions, either because they've lost a sort of performance legitimacy, we feel like they don't do enough for us as they're supposed to, or as elites signal that we should not trust them by denying elections or tearing them down, we see a sort of real deracination of social trust. I believe this is downstream, whether it's in South Africa, Zimbabwe, Hungary, Russia, or the United States. This relationship, I believe, holds constant. Now, to say it holds constant is perhaps a little bit too cute, because of course it varies, but I think there's something fundamental to that. If we go back to the original thing, I started with this idea of like, think about somebody whose political decisions totally perplex you. Right. One thing you could look at is you could say, well, okay, when those relationships came apart largely as a response to institutions, right? We lose our sort of. I'm not the most articulate person here. Let me try. We've lost a lot of personal relationships as a response to national or federal politics and elections. And as we move apart from one another, the types of candidates and policies that will support themselves diverge. And so there's a sort of constant divergence that falls into Rothstein's idea of a social trap. So how does that sort of, I guess, relate to us? I think in some ways the story of African politics is the story of European politics and the story of American politics, right? Norms are so critical, and we've had hundreds of years of building norms, and we're now watching what happens as they erode. Norms, not just about institutional forbearance, but broader civility, being nice to one another. I feel like I'm starting to ramble now. I hope I've addressed that.
That's okay. Thank you for that. I want to lift up Roger's question. He said, how did we have so much trust 20 to 40 years ago? I assume you're talking about in the United States, Roger. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So this is a great question, and this is fundamentally the subject of Putnam's book. So, if I were to channel my inner Robert Putnam, I would imagine myself sitting in some fancy office at Harvard, and I would say, well, Roger, 20 to 40 years ago, I was already saying that we had less trust than we had 20 to 40 years before. Now, Putnam's argument would be, as technology has allowed us to feel more connected to one another, even if we're not physically connected, right? We get the sort of facsimile of connection without all the hard work, right? But that hard work is actually what generates trust. So Putnam talks about the idea that we used to have all these civic clubs, and people were members of like the Elk Club or the Rotary Club or whatnot. Places where people come together and not only bond but bridge, right? And they have relationships that are not determined by national identity or politics, but instead are determined by local politics, right? And by the 90s, the late 90s, when Putnam is studying for his 2000 book, he's saying people are still members of things, but they're members of like the Sierra Club, right? So they're not a member of the Rotary Club anymore, where you have to go physically be there. They're members of the Sierra Club, where you send some money away and you get like a tote bag or something like that, and it feels good, right? I'm supporting wildlife, I'm supporting whatever, but you're not actually engaging with other people. And my guess is that the internet and social media just skyrocket that. I can just be on my phone and I think I'm having conversations with people I've never met and will never need to meet. And because of that, I never really have to worry about how I interact with them. And me saying that, I mean, that's like the least original thing I could say, but I think it's probably a big part of it, right? Now, if you bring into the fact that, starting in the late 70s, early 80s, we see something that looks like a disconnection of a broad set of norms that linked bankers and businesses, government and labor unions together. And George Packer has a great article, 2011 article on this called The Broken Contract. Basically, we see American life start to come apart at the seams. And so that happens concomitant with a sort of destruction of social life. Now, I'm not Gen Z, I'm not Gen Alpha, but my guess is that for them, right, social connection is so fundamentally different to those of us here, right? I was, born in the early 80s, so I'm not like, I'm just a middle-aged dude. But, my experience up until I was 25 was I didn't have a cell phone. I went and met people in person, right? And that's like totally different than what I see my students doing. Um, I hope that, I don't know if that was a good answer. I never know if my answers are good, but I hope I've answered.
Okay, thank you, Jacob. Greg, do you want to ask your question or do you want me to ask it? Do you want to come off mute and ask it?
Yeah, let me try it. Thanks a lot, Dr. Lewis. This is a really informative session. So what I wrote was I'd like to ask whether prevention of the tyranny of the majority remains an adequate paradigm to protect fundamental liberties in the U.S. Just by way of introduction, as I listened to your work talking about, importantly, institutions being the primary sort of vessel for trust in a multi-layered society, I was thinking about the Constitutional Convention. Madison did, and the rest had this idea that they had to prevent the tyranny of the majority, meaning a faction or a group of factions that gets so big and so influential that they can essentially rob fundamental liberties from smaller factions, right? So I think that's where some of your research heads, at least parallel to what I study. And I'm curious if we need a new paradigm in this country, because for whatever reason, that part of the Constitution seems not to have endured.
Yeah. Well, I certainly think we need to rebuild. Okay. I mean, the tyranny of the majority, I think, is sort of the fundamental like foundation of civil liberties, right? Without which we could just reinstitute any number of terrible things.
Exactly.
Slavery could come back, right? Because hey, why not?
Right.
Right? And you don't need to go far throughout the world to observe, ostensibly liberal democracies that don't fundamentally protect this. So I don't know if it's because I'm like just a hardcore institutionalist or if it's because I'm just set in my ways, but I think the paradigm of the tyranny of the majority has to be central. I think so. I would yes and you rather than push back, which I would say there is a sort of there are two sort of things that have happened, I think, concomitantly over the past 40 to 50 years that have probably led to this willingness of people to just like let go of democracy. And one is this idea that democracy, particularly as you get more and more advanced, democracies get really like embedded with special interests that make it hard to generate progress, right? And by progress, I don't mean liberal or Republican or whatever progress. I just mean like building stuff, building, getting like legislation passed, right? Like moving forward in any sort of meaningful way becomes harder and harder because you navigate these special interests that themselves become like institutions. And the minute something becomes like an institution, it becomes sort of it risks ossification, and it gets a sort of veto vote or veto power, right? And so you can sort of erode the core promise of democracy without ever striking down civil liberties. Sort of you don't have to like take a flamethrower to the Constitution to to hobble the Constitution. I think
Right.
you,
We've learned
as
that
a
recently.
constitutional scholar, would know that better than I do, right? So that's, I think, the first thing is this idea that there's a just sort of accretion of silt, right, in the machine that over time needs to be shaken out, right? The second thing, and I don't want to sound too like, oh, the children are our future kind of stuff, but right, at a certain point, every every I think generation has to figure out what the norms and governing laws of their country mean to them. And certainly we've seen that over time, right? Interpretations of laws differ and change, and some laws are become more salient or less salient over time. Um, and so, do we need a new paradigm? Like, I would hope we wouldn't lose that paradigm, but I would hope we would rediscover how to communicate the importance of that paradigm in a place where the attention economy is just so like, I don't even know. It's just like you're just blasted with information the minute you open your phone, right? And like, if you're a kid, that's all you've ever seen. And so why would that not be the way the world is?
I want to lift up a question we had from Ariane.
Sorry, can you? Oh,
Yep, we can hear you.
sorry. Hi, hello. Sorry for coming late. I had problems with my signal. I'm on a ferry, but thank you so much for the little bit that I was able to see. It was really informative, and I really look forward to the recording. I just wanted to ask, in your studies, do you sincerely have a pretty good hope, or not good hope for the future of the American people trusting in the American government with due time? Hopefully with the change of administration in my lifetime. Just because I had studied in Cuba and seeing how much they were able to progress as a civil society through a sort of not fully trusting their own government, right? But like there's obviously some cooperation there, especially with the new family code is the most inclusive family code that we've seen in the world today, right? And that involved a lot of cooperation between the regular Cuban civilians and the government. And so trusting the government institutions and governance has been a lot on my mind since returning from Cuba. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for the question. Um, I would answer it in two ways. So the first was about like, what do I believe? And I think I'm just like probably stupidly optimistic person broadly, right? Like, I don't think I'd be able to do the work I do. Right? I go work in authoritarian regimes largely, and I get to meet, so like in the time I was in Zimbabwe, let me just, Zimbabwe is a highly authoritarian regime with a history of pretty deep repression. So what I mean by that is neighbors engaging essentially as arms of the state to engage to murder, torture, rape, kidnap, uh, you know, rat out people who might support the opposition. And and maybe I'm just really naive. I may be, but the people I talk to when I'm in Zim when I'm in northern Ghana, where there's I did a lot of work in northern Ghana recently, where there's this threat of terrorist organizations coming in and these sort of existing conflicts. Um, uh, hey, buddy, I'm on the middle of. Okay, go upstairs. Okay. Um, I'm sorry about that, everybody. Um, uh, I don't think I would keep doing that work if I didn't believe that there was a real hope. And again, that might just be me being naive, right? There's a sort of American optimism that I have that sometimes my French wife will scoff at, let's say. Um, in America, I already see the turds, the turning of the tide in such a way where people seem to be just tired of the hyper partisanship. And it is my hope that um, yeah, I mean, it is my hope that we can move back toward a boring politics of decency. I mean, I don't know if you've read Michael Walzer. He's a political theorist. There's a recent book called I think Toward a Politics of Decency, if I recall the title correctly. Right? I mean, there is hope if you can muster it, and I think the winds are moving that way. I think this does speak to, in some ways, Greg's question of like, what paradigms are we operating off of? And it seems to me that for a long time, the paradigm we had, which was sort of elite consensus driven democracy, was failing to provide a sense of meaning, a sense of um, meaning or a sense of fulfillment that that we probably ignored for way too long. Um, And I see people striving to find that. And sometimes they strive in ways that I don't think are healthy. Um, but the push for meaning, right, like I think is critical and fundamental to humanity. Viktor Frankl, right, wrote his whole book on sort of man's search for meaning. And I guess I'm always going to vote or always going to put my chips on the optimistic side. But Uslana would just say, well, you're just sort of optimistic by nature, which is probably true.
I think that's a beautiful place to end it. So I'm going to call it there because that's a great note to wrap it up on, Jacob. So I just want to say thank you so much for doing this evening. It was a lot to take in, and it was just so helpful and so timely. So thank you so much to you. Thank you so much to everybody who joined us this evening. I put a link to a speaker evaluation in the chat. If you'll just click on it real quick before you leave, that would be great. And again, thank you so much for being with us tonight. And thank you to Humanities of Washington for joining us tonight. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.